A flight attendant slammed a metal coffee pot into a black teen's face. 1 minute later, his father boarded the plane in full uniform. What happens next will leave you speechless. He shattered a coffee pot across a teen's face, certain no one would rise against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. Malik Granger first sensed something was wrong the moment he stepped onto the plane. He moved down the narrow aisle of Stratton Air Flight 227, the cabin filled with the hushed shuffling of boarding passengers, overhead compartments clicking shut, and the low rumble of settling luggage. The recycled air was tinged with coffee and the faint scent of jet fuel, but Malik's focus was razor-sharp. He clutched his backpack against his chest, eyes scanning for seat 18B. He wanted this flight to go smoothly, just 3 hours in the air, a short layover, and then the weekend debate tournament he had spent months preparing for. But as he approached his row, his steps slowed. The flight attendant posted near the middle of the cabin, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly pressed uniform and a clipped name tag reading T. Calder, was staring at him. Not just watching in the way airline staff often do, but staring, his eyes tracking Malik with a scowl that seemed carved into his face. The air between them thickened. Malik instinctively adjusted the navy hoodie that hung loosely around his frame and tucked the spiral-bound notebook deeper under his arm. He nodded politely. Calder didn't nod back. Instead, he stepped slightly aside, allowing Malik to pass with the stiffness of someone forced by duty rather than intent. Malik murmured a quiet, "Excuse me," as he squeezed into the middle seat between a sleeping older man on the aisle and a teenage boy wearing oversized headphones by the window. He slid his bag beneath the seat in front of him, careful not to nudge the man's legs. As Malik fastened his seatbelt, his eyes flicked back toward Calder. The attendant was still watching him, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched as if chewing on some unspoken grudge. The look wasn't confusion. It wasn't boredom. It was something more pointed. Malik turned away and tried to ignore it. He pulled out his notebook and opened to the page marked in red ink. Opening statement. Lead speaker. His team had trusted him with the prime spot this time. All those late nights practicing voice control and rebuttal timing had finally paid off. This wasn't just a tournament. This was his chance to prove he wasn't just the colonel's son. He was someone with a voice of his own. The cabin filled quickly. Overhead compartments slammed shut. The captain's voice came over the intercom, listing flight times and altitudes. Malik tried to concentrate on the words in his notebook, but a low unease curled beneath his ribs. Every now and then, Calder passed by his row, checking seatbelts, adjusting stray bags, smiling with hollow cheer at other passengers. But each time his gaze swept over Malik, that smile vanished. Once, Malik looked up mid-sentence just in time to catch Calder brushing past, his shoulder nearly clipping Malik's. He said nothing. Neither did Calder. Malik clenched his pen. "Don't start anything," he told himself. "Not here. Not now." The aircraft jolted slightly as it taxied, and he swallowed hard, leaning back against the seat. Outside the window, the edges of the terminal blurred past. The man beside him shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and the boy at the window kept tapping at a game on his phone, oblivious to everything around him. The wheels lifted. They were airborne. The world tilted, and so did Malik's thoughts. He imagined what his father would say if he knew about that stare, probably something like, "People like that only win if you let them get under your skin." Desmond Granger was many things: a war-tested strategist, a respected officer, and a father whose expectations felt like armor and weight at the same time. He had always told Malik that strength wasn't about showing power, it was about knowing when not to. So Malik sat still. He breathed slowly. He focused on his notes. But Calder wasn't finished. About 30 minutes into the flight, the attendant returned to his aisle. This time, he stopped. Malik looked up. "You good?" Calder asked curtly. No friendliness, just suspicion sharpened into words. Malik nodded, confused. "Yes, sir." Calder's eyes narrowed slightly as if even that polite answer was a challenge. Without another word, he moved on. The boy at the window raised an eyebrow. "Weird dude," he muttered, yanking off one side of his headphones. Malik forced a smile. "Guess he's having a long day." But that wasn't it. This wasn't fatigue or stress. It was targeted. And Malik had felt that feeling before, at gas stations, in locker rooms, on school hallways where he was the only black kid in a sea of smirking indifference. But it had never happened 30,000 feet in the air. never with nowhere to go. He stared at the lines of his notebook again. Every voice has value, no matter how small or dismissed. That was his opening line. He didn't change it, but the words suddenly meant something different now, more personal, more urgent. As the plane cruised toward its destination, tension settled over Malik like a second skin. The man in uniform had made his presence known, and it wasn't kindness he offered. The rest of the passengers talked quietly, flipped through in-flight magazines, or scrolled on screens. No one else seemed to feel what Malik felt, but something told him, deep in the space between instinct and fear, that this journey was changing shape, that it wasn't just about debate or travel anymore. It was about being seen, or not being seen, about the way silence could be a shield or a trap. And somewhere inside him, Malik knew, he thought this would be a journey toward his first victory, not the darkest battle of his young life. The cart rolled past with a soft rattle of wheels and clinking cups, and Malik Granger raised his hand halfway, hesitant, polite. "Excuse me, sir. May I have some water, please?" His voice was steady, rehearsed in the quiet tone his father always advised when dealing with authority. Flight attendant Travis Calder, stocky and sharp-jawed, stopped mid-motion. His eyes flicked to Malik's face, then to the navy hoodie, then back to his notepad. Calder exhaled, a long, theatrical sigh, and reached for the water with the same energy someone might use to pick up trash. "Kids these days," he muttered, just loud enough. Malik's stomach clenched. He heard it clearly. So did the passenger next to him, an older man in a gray blazer who shifted awkwardly in his seat. But no one said a word. Calder poured the water with slow hands, the cup trembling ever so slightly as he held it out. Malik accepted it without looking up. "Thank you," he said softly. Calder gave no reply. He simply turned and moved on, his footsteps clipped and deliberate. Malik stared at the cup in his hand for a moment. The plastic rim was thin, bending slightly under his fingers. He sipped, but it did little to ease the dryness in his throat. He opened his notebook again, trying to focus. "Every voice has value, no matter how small or dismissed," he wrote. But even the words, so full of purpose when he practiced at home, felt hollow now. The lights above flickered as mild turbulence rocked the cabin. Overhead bins creaked and trays rattled in their latches. Calder reappeared like a storm cloud striding briskly down the aisle to lock down the beverage cart. As he passed Malik's row, the edge of the cart clipped the teen's elbow. The notebook nearly slipped from his lap. "Ow!" Malik winced, clutching his arm. No apology, no pause. Calder moved on without even glancing back. The man in the gray blazer leaned in slightly. "You all right, son?" he whispered. Malik nodded, jaw tight. "Yeah, I'm fine," but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. The man looked uneasy but said nothing more. Malik returned to his notes, but his fingers trembled faintly as he flipped the page. The minutes dragged. Calder's coldness didn't let up. When a boy in the row behind asked for pretzels, Calder grinned and handed them over with a wink. But when Malik reached for the snack offered on the tray, Calder abruptly jerked it back. "Did I say you could touch that?" Calder said sharply. Malik blinked in surprise. "I thought it was part of the—" Calder dropped the snack pack with a hard thud on the tray, cutting him off. "Think next time before you assume." Across the aisle, a man cleared his throat, glancing over with raised eyebrows but then lowered his eyes to his newspaper. The unspoken message was clear. Don't get involved. Malik clenched his fists beneath the tray. His mind screamed to respond, to say something, to demand the respect he knew he deserved. But echoing louder than that fury was his father's voice in memory. "Choose your battles wisely, son." He pressed his back into the seat, biting the inside of his cheek. Just a few more hours. Then he'd be off the plane and this man would be behind him. But the ache in his arm, the sting of embarrassment and the weight of the stairs he imagined but didn't see made the minutes feel like stones dropped into his chest. He focused again on his speech draft, eyes scanning the lines. But the letters blurred, twisting beneath a growing knot in his stomach. Another jolt of turbulence shook the plane, stronger this time. A few gasps filled the air as the lights flickered again. The captain's voice crackled overhead, advising passengers to remain seated. Calder stormed past once more, checking bins and barking half-hearted instructions. As he reached Malik's row again, Malik tried to shift his legs slightly, cramped from hours of stillness. He began to rise just an inch to stretch. "Hey," Calder snapped, stopping abruptly. "Sit down." "Now, I was just stretching. You're blocking the aisle. Do you think the rules don't apply to you?" Calder's voice had risen above the ambient hum, drawing heads. Malik froze halfway up. "Sir, I'm not." "Don't sir me," Calder barked. "I've been watching you the whole flight." Slouched, entitled, always needing something. Malik straightened fully now, his voice rising slightly with his pulse. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Oh, so now you've got attitude too." The rows fell silent. Even the hum of whispered conversation had disappeared. Passengers turned, first a few, then nearly the whole cabin, sensing something shifting, something unnatural in the air. Calder's hand rested on the edge of the service cart. His face was flushed, jaw tight, and then, without warning, his hand darted downward. He gripped the coffee pot. Malik's eyes went wide, instinctively taking a step back into the aisle. The pot was still full, steam coiling faintly from its spout. Calder's knuckles whitened around the handle as he raised it. No one moved. It was like time had paused, the hiss of the cabin pressurization louder now than any voice. Malik didn't know whether to duck, to speak, to run, only that this man, this uniformed authority, was not reaching for a tool of service. He was lifting a weapon, and deep in Malik's chest, something broke. Sometimes silence doesn't keep the peace, it only delays the storm. The tray slammed down with a jarring thud, the force of it rattling the plastic cup so violently that droplets of hot tea leapt out and nearly landed in Malik's lap. The noise alone turned a few heads, but it was Calder's voice that truly shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. "You better learn respect before asking favors," he snapped. Malik blinked, stunned. His mouth was still halfway through a quiet thank you. The words stalled, stranded on his tongue. Around him, the murmurs of nearby passengers fell into an uncomfortable hush. One man in a business suit glanced over, then quickly looked away, pretending to adjust his headphones. A young couple 3 rows ahead paused their movie, watching from the corner of their screen. Malik's cheeks burned. His hand tightened around the paper napkin folded on the tray, crinkling it silently. He forced himself to nod and look down, avoiding eye contact with Calder, who stood over him just a beat too long, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed like a warning. Then the flight attendant turned on his heel and pushed the cart down the aisle, muttering something inaudible. Malik didn't move. His ears rang, not from the noise, but from humiliation. He felt every pair of invisible eyes judging him, questioning whether he had done something wrong. But he hadn't. He had spoken politely, clearly. All he had asked for was tea and a little extra sugar. As the cart rattled farther away, Malik tried to recenter himself. He picked up his notebook from the seat pocket and flipped to the page marked Opening Argument, Finals. At the top, in his neat handwriting, the first line read, "Every voice has value, no matter how small or dismissed." He stared at those words, now bitter with irony. He swallowed hard. His throat was dry. That single moment, brief, insignificant to some, had set something off. Not just embarrassment, something heavier, something tight and silent, like storm clouds before a downpour. He could still feel Calder's disdain lingering in the air like smoke. After several minutes, Malik stood carefully, stretching his cramped legs. The cabin was dim, hushed by the low hum of the engines and passengers slipping into quiet routines. He reached upward toward the luggage bin for balance and turned to step into the aisle. Before he could fully straighten, a sudden presence blocked his path. "Sit down," Calder barked. Malik froze. Calder had returned silently, pushing the empty cart back toward the galley. The man's arms were stiff, his stance firm like a gate refusing entry. "I'm just stretching," Malik said evenly, trying to keep his voice low and respectful. "You're obstructing the aisle." "Sit." "Now," Calder said, louder this time. Passengers nearby stirred again. A child peeked over the seatback. The man in the business suit looked up from his phone, eyebrows rising. "I wasn't in anyone's way," Malik said, heart beginning to pound in his chest. "I just needed to stretch. I said sit down." This time the words weren't just loud. They were laced with something colder, a tone that had nothing to do with safety protocols. It was command for command's sake. Calder's voice cut through the cabin like a whip. Malik, torn between obedience and principle, glanced toward the back of the plane. The flight was still in mid-cruise. No service trolleys coming, no line forming for the lavatory, no one else had been stopped for standing. "I have a right to stretch," Malik said. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from trying to hold back the anger building inside. "You don't make the rules here," Calder hissed. "You follow them." There was something in Calder's expression now, a twist of frustration not aimed just at Malik, but built from something older, deeper, festering. His eyes flicked to Malik's hoodie, then to his notebook, then back again, as if each detail confirmed something he had already decided about him. Malik exhaled slowly. "I'm not trying to cause a problem." But Calder was no longer listening. In one swift motion, he reached down to the cart, gripping the handle of the metal coffee pot. It was still warm, steam fogging lightly around its rim, the black plastic lid creaking as it tilted in Calder's tight fist. The sudden change in his posture made time crawl. Malik's eyes locked onto the pot. Calder didn't speak. His lips were pressed into a hard, unreadable line, but his stance, angled forward, shoulders tight, the pot slightly raised, spoke volumes. He wasn't reaching for service. He was bracing for something else. A whisper from the couple up front, a sharp inhale from the older man on the aisle. The silence had shifted from awkward to electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Sir," Malik said carefully, stepping back half a pace, "you don't need to—" "Are you refusing to comply with crew orders?" Calder barked. "I'm not refusing," Malik said, louder now. "You're overreacting. You're out of line. And you're making this worse," Malik shot back before he could stop himself. His voice echoed slightly, too loud in the tight space. The entire cabin went still. Overhead, fans hummed. A baby cried softly in the distance. Calder's knuckles turned white on the pot handle. His nostrils flared. In Malik's mind, his father's voice rang clear, "Choose your battles wisely, son." But this moment no longer felt like a choice. Calder's next move was imperceptibly fast. A single step forward, the pot now fully off the cart. Malik didn't even flinch. He was frozen. The sight of that silver cylinder, gleaming in the overhead light, made his breath catch. It wasn't the heat that scared him. It was the look in Calder's eyes, the intent. Across the aisle, a teenage boy reached for his phone, fumbled, too slow. Another man rose from his seat as if to speak, then sank back down, uncertain. Malik stood perfectly still, his spine straight, his eyes steady even as fear curled in his stomach. He had spoken no threats. He had raised no hands. And yet, here he was, treated like a problem to be subdued. Passengers watched, many silently, some already regretting their silence. And Calder was no longer a flight attendant. He was a storm looking for a target. What followed would burn itself into every memory aboard that flight. The pot was raised not as a tool of service, but as a weapon of rage. The impact came without warning. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the cabin as the bottom edge of the coffee pot smashed into Malik Granger's face. The metal struck with terrifying force, crunching against bone and flesh. At the same instant, a gush of scalding liquid burst across his cheek, soaking the navy fabric of his hoodie and sending waves of blistering heat into his skin. His cry was instant but choked, collapsing into a garbled scream as pain overwhelmed his senses. He stumbled backward, caught off guard, and fell hard into the narrow aisle between seats, limbs twisting unnaturally. Gasps rose like a wave from the rows of passengers. Trays rattled. Cups spilled. Someone let out a panicked scream. But the loudest sound was the silence that followed, an eerie pause where disbelief robbed everyone of words. Time seemed to slow, the steady drone of the engines the only constant as the horror of what had just happened began to settle. Malik clutched his face, fingers trembling as they met torn skin and searing heat. Blood pulsed through the gaps in his fingers, mingling with the hot coffee pooling beneath him. His legs kicked instinctively, seeking escape from the pain, but his body was already shutting down under the trauma. The left side of his face felt like it was melting, the skin blistering where the liquid had hit, and his cheekbone throbbed with a sharpness that suggested something inside had cracked. He couldn't breathe right. The heat, the shock, the noise. "Stay down," barked Travis Calder. The flight attendant's voice, once dismissive and smug, now thundered with a manic authority that startled even those trying to help. Several passengers who had begun to rise, men from aisle seats, young and old, froze in place. Calder's posture was rigid, his arms spread slightly like a gatekeeper daring anyone to step closer. The coffee pot dangled from his right hand, drops of brown and red liquid dripping from its dented rim. His name tag shimmered faintly under the harsh cabin lights, a reminder that he was still, technically, in control. "I said stay in your seats," Calder snapped again, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. He swept his gaze across the cabin like a cornered animal, adrenaline pushing him into something worse than panic, dominance. For a moment, the very uniform he wore confused those around him. Some passengers sat back down in hesitation, unsure whether to treat him as a threat or an authority figure. Others kept recording silently on their phones, holding them low, faces pale. On the floor, Malik writhed. The pain was unbearable, primal. Tears streamed from his good eye, the other one already swollen shut. His mouth opened and closed, trying to form words, trying to ask why, but none came. The scald had reached the base of his neck, and his lips trembled from the agony. Blood trickled into his ear, and the world blurred. One shoe slipped halfway off his foot as he tried to roll onto his side, seeking something, someone, to anchor him. One man, a passenger in his 30s seated near the emergency exit, leaned into the aisle. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice thick with shock. "He's just a kid." Calder turned sharply. "He charged at me." "Tried to grab the cart," he shouted, lifting the battered pot like a badge of defense. His face twitched, sweat now breaking across his forehead. "I acted in self-defense." But the lie was already crumbling. No one had seen Malik charge. No one had seen aggression. What they had seen was a young boy stand to stretch and get yelled at, scolded like a criminal, and then, seconds later, struck like one. The man who had spoken slowly sat back down, not out of compliance but to keep filming, hands steady now. The scent of burned flesh was strong. Malik's hoodie clung to his chest, soaked and sticking, the navy fabric now blotched with red and dark brown. A medic, one of the passengers seated in row 7C, unbuckled himself quietly. He reached into his carry-on for a small first aid pouch, trying not to draw attention. As he slipped down the aisle on one knee, eyes focused on Malik, Calder snapped toward him. "Sir, sit down." "I'm a medic," the man said firmly, holding up his ID badge. "You need to back away from him now." Calder hesitated, caught between instinct and control. The coffee pot wobbled in his grip, his knuckles white around the handle. He seemed to shrink for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing against the uniform he wore. Then he stepped back. Not because he agreed, but because too many phones were recording now. Too many eyes were locked on him with disbelief, and maybe something darker, condemnation. The medic knelt beside Malik and began assessing the burns. "Hey, stay with me," he said gently, his voice low. "You're okay. We've got you. Can you hear me?" Malik blinked once, the motion barely visible through the swelling. His lips moved. "Dad," he whispered. The medic leaned closer. "What's that?" "Dad. My dad. He'll come." The words were broken, gasped, but filled with something raw and aching. It wasn't just pain. It was a cry for rescue. A cry for someone who had always stood between Malik and danger. "All right," the medic said, his tone shifting. "You hold on to that thought, okay? We're landing soon. Help is coming." In the background, the cabin phone buzzed with the captain's voice overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've initiated an emergency diversion. Please remain seated. We are landing at Hudson Field Airport in 15 minutes. Medical assistance will be waiting upon arrival." The flight attendants not involved in the incident moved in awkward silence, avoiding Calder's gaze, unsure whether to treat him as a peer or a threat. One of them, a junior attendant named Harris, looked visibly shaken as he helped secure the aisles, his hands trembling with every movement. Calder stood near the galley, staring at his hands. The coffee pot was gone now, placed quietly out of sight, but the stain remained. On his shirt, on the floor, and in the horrified faces of the passengers who would never forget what they saw. He muttered under his breath, pacing, as though trying to convince himself of his own innocence. Malik, meanwhile, lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The medic pressed gauze to the worst of the burns, whispering to a nearby passenger to pass him a water bottle. His thoughts flickered in and out like candlelight in wind, but one image stayed steady, the shape of his father's silhouette, straight-backed in uniform, waiting beyond this nightmare. He didn't know that Desmond Granger was already in the same city. He didn't know that the man who had taught him how to salute, how to breathe through fear, how to speak with truth, was already moving, faster than any command could send him, toward the gate. The jet engines droned, the descent began, and the plane shuddered slightly as landing gear extended. And through the chaos, the confusion, and the silence that followed, one single thought stayed anchored in Malik's pain-drenched mind. Pain had silenced Malik's voice, but his father's shadow was closer than anyone realized. The moment the metal coffee pot struck Malik's face, the cabin unraveled. Screams ricocheted down the aisle like bullets, slicing through the recycled air. The hot liquid had splashed across his left cheek, searing skin instantly, while the force of the blow fractured bone and sent Malik crashing sideways into the narrow aisle. His notebook of debate points fluttered to the floor, pages stained red as he writhed, clutching his face, gasping for air through the rising steam and agony. "Someone help him!" a passenger shouted, voice tight with panic. Blood mixed with coffee pooled on the scuffed cabin floor. Amid the chaos, an older man, passenger 22A, stood up abruptly. "I'm a medic," he called out. Calder didn't stop him, perhaps because the mask of command had finally slipped, revealing the raw panic beneath. The medic dropped to his knees beside Malik and tore open the emergency medical kit under the seat. His hands moved quickly but gently, pressing gauze and cloth against the teen's cheek while whispering words that tried to soothe through the boy's choked sobs. "You're all right, son. Stay with me." Deep breaths now. Deep breaths. Malik blinked slowly, barely conscious, lips trembling. His body shivered from shock as pain clawed at him. But somewhere behind the haze, he saw flashes, memories of his father's firm grip during martial arts practice, the time they'd patched up a scraped knee during a camping trip, the proud nod Desmond gave after Malik's first public speech. His father was a man of structure, rules, and discipline, and right now he was far away, or so Malik believed. Calder stood frozen beside the beverage cart, eyes darting to the phones now aimed directly at him. Dozens of hands held up devices, recording in silence. His voice cracked as he barked, "Stop filming!" "This isn't." He was aggressive. He lunged at me. No one moved. The captain's voice echoed faintly through the intercom to the crew. "Prepare for emergency descent." Nearest available airport, 2 minutes to clearance. The plane banked slightly. Bags shifted. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but tension did. Calder stumbled backward, gripping the overhead bin for support. His face was pale now, the confidence and cruelty that marked his earlier conduct eroding in real time under the weight of collective judgment. A younger man in row 19 rose with fists clenched, but another passenger stopped him with a hand on his chest, whispering, "Let the cameras handle this." The medic leaned closer to Malik, who drifted in and out of awareness, breath thin and rattled. "Focus on me, all right?" the man said gently. "You're safe now." Malik tried to speak, but only a strained, broken sound came out. Overhead, the engines groaned softly as the plane dipped into its descent. The captain's voice returned, clipped and low. "Medical crew confirmed on ground. Emergency responders en route." In the cockpit, a co-pilot turned to the captain. Did he really hit that kid with a coffee pot?" The captain, gripping the yoke harder than necessary, nodded once without turning. "Radio it in. Let ground control know we have a juvenile assault victim. Suspect is a crew." Back in the cabin, the air had gone heavy. Even the crying toddlers had quieted. Everyone was waiting, watching. The medic did what he could to shield Malik's burns from the air, wrapping his hoodie's edge over exposed skin. Malik's blood had soaked into the cotton, turning navy into a dark, haunting maroon. Travis Calder, the man who had once controlled this flight with curt orders and sharp glares, now seemed small. His fingers twitched as he looked toward the front of the plane. Perhaps he was calculating escape, or perhaps he was realizing, too late, the gravity of what he had done. One of the men filming muttered to another, "That boy didn't even raise his voice." "They're gonna bury this guy," the other replied. But Calder hadn't heard them. He was staring out the window now, as if hoping the earth might open and swallow the consequences before landing gear touched down. 2 rows behind Malik, a passenger in a blue button-down leaned forward and whispered to his seatmate. "You hear who's waiting at the terminal?" There was a soldier on the inbound flight. "Name's Granger, I think." "Granger?" the man beside him replied. "Wait, Desmond Granger? From the 23rd Recon?" "Yeah, they said his son was on this flight." The seatmate's eyes widened. "No way." As the aircraft began its final descent, Malik stirred. His hand twitched. The medic gently held it down, whispering, "It's okay." You're landing soon. And then, through the fog of agony, Malik's mind grasped one fragile thought. One name, one hope. Father. The wheels screamed as they struck tarmac. Brakes whined. The cabin jolted. Outside, emergency vehicles had already formed a perimeter. Red and white lights painted the belly of the aircraft as it taxied to a halt far from the main gate. The air stairs were rolled up manually by 2 ground crewmen who hadn't even changed out of their standard reflective vests. The cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and cool, outside air swept in, carrying with it a stillness that seemed too calm for what had just happened. And then he appeared. Colonel Desmond Granger stood at the base of the stairs, tall and immovable. Dressed in full uniform, beret tucked crisply under his arm, he was the image of command. Every crease in his jacket was precise. His boots gleamed, but none of that mattered compared to the look in his eyes. Passengers at the windows craned their necks. A murmur rippled through the front rows. The whispers spread. That's him. That's the boy's father. Granger didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze scanned the open door, caught sight of the stretcher being maneuvered toward the exit, and froze. There lay Malik, face wrapped in blood-stained cloth, lips cracked from dehydration, his burned skin barely visible through the gauze. For 1/2 second, the colonel's rigid posture faltered, his throat tightening against grief. Then, with steel in his steps, he moved forward. Calder, now huddled in the galley near the door, stiffened as he recognized the man striding toward him. Panic flickered across his face. "Colonel Granger, I can explain," he started, voice rising like a child caught in a lie. "Your son, he moved too fast, I thought." Desmond didn't answer. He simply stepped past him. He walked beside the stretcher as paramedics eased Malik down the stairs. One of them whispered, "Sir, he's stable, but he needs immediate care." Desmond nodded once and leaned down toward his son. He spoke in a tone only Malik could hear. "I'm here." "You're safe now." Malik didn't respond, but his fingers, faintly, curled around the edge of the stretcher sheet. As the colonel rose, his eyes locked once more with Calder's. There was no fury in them, no yelling, just something far colder, something final. And Calder, for the first time, looked truly afraid. Passengers stood silently in the windows, their phones still raised, recording not just a story, but the beginning of a reckoning. The man Calder feared least was the one already waiting at the gate. The aircraft screeched onto the tarmac, tires screaming against the concrete, jerking the cabin forward with a violent jolt. Inside, the tension was electric. No one spoke. Eyes were wide. Some passengers clutched the armrests with white knuckles, not from fear of a crash, but from the weight of what had just happened. As the plane rolled to a halt, emergency lights flashed through the cabin windows, red, white, and blue beams sweeping like searchlights across faces still frozen in shock. The moment the aircraft doors unsealed with a pressurized hiss, the cabin was overtaken by the sharp bark of paramedics boarding in rapid motion. Boots clanged on the metal floor. A stretcher wheeled down the narrow aisle like a lifeline. Malik Granger lay slumped in row 18, his hoodie soaked through with blood, the side of his face blistered and grotesquely swollen. Steam still curled faintly from the fabric where the boiling coffee had seared into skin. One of the medics, a bearded man with tired eyes, leaned in and began calling Malik's name softly, checking for responsiveness. Malik stirred weakly. His lips barely moved, but no sound came. He winced as the straps of the gurney wrapped across his chest, every inch of his body aching like it had been dragged through fire. His right eye was sealed shut from swelling. His left flickered with confusion and fear. As they lifted him, a soft moan escaped. The medic nodded to his partner, then turned to the crew with a single command. "We need him off, now." Behind them, Travis Calder stood rooted at the edge of the galley, hands trembling slightly though he kept them clenched at his sides. His uniform bore brown stains where the coffee had splashed back during the assault, abstract patterns of guilt that refused to be ignored. He tried to adjust his posture, to look composed, but the shifting glances from the passengers burned into him. The murmurs started again. Words like monster, boy, and unprovoked drifted through the air like smoke. Calder ignored them, or tried to. He looked toward the cockpit, silently begging for a distraction, any distraction that could pull him out of this unraveling scene. It came, but not in the way he expected. From the top of the mobile stair platform just outside the open cabin door, a man in full military dress stood motionless. Colonel Desmond Granger. His tall frame filled the doorway like a statue carved in steel. His dark green service uniform was pressed to perfection, his polished black boots reflecting the airport floodlights, and his beret, creased and curled, rested beneath one arm. He said nothing as he stepped forward, descending the short staircase with precise, controlled strides. The paramedics, halfway down the same stairs with Malik's stretcher, instinctively paused. One of them, unfamiliar with the unfolding story, stepped aside respectfully. Desmond's gaze dropped immediately to the boy lying beneath white gauze and blood-streaked cotton. A sharp breath escaped him, almost too small to hear, but heavy enough to shake the air around him. He moved forward, slowly, like a soldier walking across a minefield he could not see but knew existed. Calder's chest rose and fell quickly now. His throat worked as he tried to swallow. He saw Desmond looking down at Malik's ruined face, then slowly raising his eyes. Their eyes met. Desmond's stare was not filled with rage. It was not even hate. It was colder than both. It was judgment. Pure, disciplined, unwavering judgment. It was the kind of gaze that made lesser men forget how to speak. Calder's lips parted as if to offer a reason, maybe an apology, but no words came. Desmond's eyes flicked downward to the drops of coffee staining Calder's shirt, then upward again, locking with such intensity that Calder actually took a step back. One of the passengers, an older man still standing in the aisle, muttered under his breath, "That's the boy's father." Desmond walked beside the stretcher now, one hand briefly brushing his son's arm. "You're okay, son. You hear me?" His voice was low, steady, deeply grounded in something unbreakable. Malik didn't respond, but his chest moved slightly in reaction. That was enough. Desmond turned to the lead medic. "Military Base Hospital. I'm invoking immediate jurisdictional transfer. I'll have authorization within minutes." The medic blinked, but nodded. Something about Desmond's presence overrode any hesitation. The man was clearly used to giving orders and having them followed. Behind them, Calder finally found his voice. "Colonel, sir, it wasn't like it looked," he stammered, stepping forward. The kid was disruptive. I followed protocol. It got out of hand, but I didn't." Desmond didn't stop walking. He didn't turn, but his voice cut the air like a blade. "Speak another word," he said, "and you'll answer for it under oath." Calder froze, his mouth still open, the excuse dead before it reached breath. At the foot of the stairs, security officers appeared. 3 men in navy jackets with airport authority patches, earpieces glowing under the lights. They moved to flank Calder, motioning for him to follow. One of them whispered something, and Calder nodded numbly. The bravado he'd once carried, the smug tilt of his chin from earlier in the flight, had vanished. As Malik's stretcher was wheeled toward the waiting ambulance, the gathered crowd at the gate grew in size. Passengers from other flights paused, staring at the strange procession, medical responders, a military officer, a bloodied teen, and a crew member now flanked by security. Inside the aircraft, silence lingered. A flight once filled with ordinary distractions, snack wrappers, in-flight magazines, polite chatter, had transformed into a crucible of reckoning. One by one, passengers rose from their seats, many recording with trembling hands. A boy had been attacked. A man had stood waiting at the very gate of justice. And now, for the first time since the assault, there was movement. Not just physical, but moral. The kind that signaled consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were marching up the jet bridge, dressed in military green. Calder watched Desmond vanish into the ambulance bay beside the medics and his son. He lowered his head, realizing, perhaps too late, that this wasn't just about what happened on the plane. This was about what would follow and who would be leading it. And as the cabin door shut behind the last passenger, the engine hum faded into silence. A single thought remained suspended in the air. The soldier had not yet spoken, but his presence alone was a sentence. The stretcher wheels clattered harshly over the metal ramp as Malik's unconscious body was rushed out of the aircraft. Colonel Desmond Granger, still in uniform, fell into step beside the paramedics without a word, his boots landing with measured force against the pavement. His eyes never left his son. The bandages wrapped around Malik's swollen face were already stained through, and his breathing came in short, uneven gasps beneath the oxygen mask. The scent of burned fabric and scorched skin clung to him like smoke trailing after a fire. Desmond leaned down, walking close to the gurney, and whispered softly near his son's ear, "You're strong, son. I'm here now. I've got you." His voice was steady, but his clenched jaw and rigid posture betrayed the storm inside. Behind them, Travis Calder stepped off the plane surrounded by 2 airport security officers. His stride faltered as he spotted the tall man in uniform beside the stretcher. Recognition hit like a falling hammer. Calder opened his mouth, stumbling forward. I didn't mean for it to get that far," he said, his voice cracking. "The boy wouldn't listen." He was obstructing the aisle. I followed procedure. Desmond turned just slightly, his gaze landing on Calder with the precision of a blade. He said nothing, but that silence, rigid, searing, and absolute, cut deeper than any accusation. Calder tried again. He wouldn't follow directions. I was trying to maintain order. These flights get stressful. "You struck an unarmed boy with a scalding object," one of the officers said coldly, positioning himself between Calder and the colonel. "Save it for the investigators." Desmond returned his eyes to Malik, watching as the medics checked vitals and increased the flow of oxygen. One of them, a younger man with a trembling voice, cleared his throat and asked, "Colonel Granger, sir, where would you like the patient taken?" Desmond didn't hesitate. "Divert from City General. He's going to Westfield Base Hospital. Direct order. Contact the base ahead. I want the trauma wing prepped." The medic blinked. "Sir, that's military protocol." "I outrank protocol today," Desmond said flatly. "Make the call." The medic nodded and turned to his radio. Desmond's focus narrowed back to his son. He reached out and gently pulled the strap of Malik's backpack, still slung weakly over one shoulder, away from the stretcher to prevent it from catching on the railing. His fingers paused when he noticed the dark scorch mark burned into the hoodie. Beneath it, faint but visible, was the red embroidery of Malik's debate team logo. It was more than just clothing. It was Malik's pride, his preparation, his future, and it had been burned by arrogance, by cruelty, by a man who should never have been allowed to serve in uniform. Shouts erupted behind them. Passengers who had disembarked were gathering at the terminal windows and gate entrance, phones raised, recording everything. One man, still clutching his carry-on, called out, "The kid didn't do anything." That flight attendant lost it. "He asked for sugar with his tea," another man yelled, furious. "That's all." It was unprovoked. A chorus of voices followed, some angry, some shaken, all pointing in one direction. Calder looked overwhelmed, his confidence evaporating. "This is out of context. They didn't see what happened before." Desmond didn't even glance back. He raised one hand and motioned to a nearby military officer stationed at the airport checkpoint. The man approached quickly. "Ensure airport security begins a proper chain of custody record," Desmond instructed. "Gather the video recordings. Every angle, every passenger statement. I want this documented cleanly. Understood?" The officer nodded sharply. "Yes, Colonel." The stretcher reached the waiting ambulance. Desmond climbed in behind it. One of the paramedics moved to close the door but paused. "Sir, are you family?" "I'm his father," Desmond said without hesitation, "and I'll be riding with him." The man stepped back. The doors slammed shut. Inside the ambulance, the steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. Desmond sat beside his son, his hand resting lightly on Malik's. He watched the boy's chest rise and fall, each breath proof that he still had time. Time to fight, time to heal, time to speak again. But Desmond knew this was not just a father's pain. It was a soldier's reckoning. Somewhere along the line, the system had failed. A man like Calder should have never been trusted with lives. The uniform he wore should have meant safety, not fear. And someone, somewhere, had enabled this. Desmond stared at the cracked plastic of the heart monitor screen. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. But something inside him, something hard and focused, began to move. This was no longer a moment of grief. It was a moment of transformation. Outside, as the ambulance sped away under flashing lights, Calder remained surrounded by security officers watching the taillights vanish. In his chest, the sinking feeling was no longer fear. It was recognition. He hadn't just hurt a teenager. He had ignited something far more dangerous. A father's mission had shifted from silence to justice. He thought burning and breaking a black kid mid-flight would be forgotten. But justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The moment Desmond Granger stepped through the reinforced glass doors of Westfield Base Hospital, the air shifted. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over spotless white floors, and the scent of antiseptic burned faintly in his nostrils. The rhythmic beeping of machines echoed down the hall like a metronome, counting down to something he couldn't yet see. But Desmond didn't flinch. His boots struck the floor in deliberate steps as he approached room 214, the name Malik Granger printed neatly on the clipboard outside. He didn't need to read it. He felt it, every second of this nightmare etched into his chest like a brand. Inside the room, silence reigned, broken only by the low hum of medical machines monitoring a body that had once been so full of energy and drive. Malik lay unconscious on the hospital bed, wrapped in gauze and bruises, his face barely recognizable beneath the swelling. Desmond paused at the threshold, one hand gripping the doorframe as if steadying himself against a wave. His son, his only son, had boarded that plane full of purpose and pride. Now he looked like a casualty of war. Desmond moved closer, stopping beside the bed. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching Malik's chest rise and fall beneath the blanket, the breaths shallow but steady. For a moment, all his years of discipline, training, and leadership felt useless. No tactical plan could undo the damage here. He reached out and gently adjusted the edge of the blanket, as if the smallest act of comfort could shield his son from what had happened. A soft knock came from the doorway. Major Franklin Ross entered with quiet steps, his presence familiar but solemn. The file under his arm seemed heavier than paper should allow. "I came as soon as I heard," Franklin said, voice low. His eyes fell on Malik, and he swallowed hard before meeting Desmond's gaze. "He's stable, but the trauma is significant. Facial fractures. Burns. They're working on reducing the swelling before surgery." Desmond nodded slowly, his jaw tense. "He's 17, Frank." 17. Franklin stepped beside him and opened the file on the table near the window. "There's something else you need to see." Desmond didn't look away from Malik. "If it's more medical reports, I've already read them." "It's not medical," Franklin said. "It's about Calder." That got Desmond's attention. He turned, his expression hardening. Franklin slid the documents toward him. Internal memos. HR files. Closed incident reports from Stratton Air. Desmond opened the file, scanning the pages with a soldier's precision. Each entry was worse than the last. Passenger complaints about Calder's aggressive conduct, particularly toward young men of color. Threats. Verbal abuse. One report even mentioned a tray being thrown. But none of it had made it beyond internal arbitration. "They buried this," Desmond said, his voice barely above a whisper but taut with anger. "They knew." Franklin nodded grimly. Every single case was handled internally. No suspensions, no press, just back to the skies like nothing happened. Desmond's fingers curled over the edges of the file. "Who covered this?" "Upper management," Franklin replied. "Legal team advised against disciplinary action. Said disciplining him without clear intent to harm might open the airline up to defamation lawsuits." Desmond's stare darkened, the edge of his voice cutting like a blade. So, instead, they risked real harm. Franklin didn't respond. He didn't need to. Desmond turned back to Malik, who lay still beneath the soft white lights, machines dutifully counting his breaths. "They built a system that protects uniforms and badges over bodies and voices." He walked toward the window, the city skyline flickering beyond the glass like distant fire. "When I was deployed overseas, I spent years training my men how to spot threats before they erupted, how to defuse them. This should have never gotten that far. A civilian airline should never carry hidden weapons disguised as employees." Franklin approached slowly. "What do you want to do?" Desmond didn't answer right away. He stared out at the horizon, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but laced with steel. "I want every document, every suppressed file, every name that signed off on Calder's continued employment. I want the pattern exposed, the names unmasked, the cowardice dragged into daylight." Franklin gave a short nod. "I'll get everything I can." "But it's going to take pulling strings," Desmond turned, a fire blazing behind his eyes. "Pull them." The two men stood in silence, the weight of truth pressing down on them like gravity. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the reckoning being born in a hospital room. Desmond returned to Malik's side, his hand hovering above his son's bandaged fingers before finally resting gently on them. Malik didn't stir, but the warmth was there. Desmond closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself, then opened them with renewed focus. "This isn't just about one violent act anymore," he said, almost to himself. Franklin's voice was quiet. No, it never was. The machine beeped steadily, a quiet heartbeat in a room full of tension, and as Desmond clenched the file tighter, the final thought that had been smoldering in his mind finally ignited into words. The burn on Malik's face was searing, but the corruption beneath was even hotter. The footage aired just after midnight. It began with a blurry shot, phones shaking in panicked hands as the sound of a young boy's scream tore through the cabin noise. Then the clearer angle appeared, a slow-motion replay of a uniformed flight attendant raising a metal coffee pot high above his head, followed by the sickening impact. Gasps and cries echoed through the recording. Someone shouted, "Help him!" Another voice screamed Malik's name. Then came the silence, the kind that feels like guilt crawling through a speaker. By dawn, the video had reached every major news outlet in the country. Colonel Desmond Granger stood in the hospital lounge, arms crossed over his chest, watching the footage loop on the screen above the vending machines. His face betrayed nothing, but the muscles in his jaw were clenched so tightly they looked carved from stone. The air felt thick. A reporter's voice played over the images, calling it an apparent case of excessive force aboard Stratton Air Flight 117 and labeling the situation under investigation. A passenger misbehavior claim? "That's what they're going with," Desmond muttered, his voice low, dangerous. Across from him, Major Franklin Ross held a tablet that was already pinging with emails. He nodded grimly. "Stratton's PR machine is spinning. They're blaming Malik for verbal threats and claiming Calder acted out of fear." Desmond's knuckles tightened around the styrofoam cup in his hand until it crumpled. He asked for tea. With sugar, Franklin didn't respond. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, but facts alone didn't always win. The colonel knew this from years of command and confrontation. Truth meant nothing if buried under enough doubt. Desmond turned away from the screen, his boots echoing against the tile floor. "This won't end in a press room," he said. "They think I'll stay silent because my son is in surgery." "They're wrong," Franklin followed, eyes scanning the corridor. "You'll need more than outrage. Stratton has lawyers on speed dial and a track record of making problems disappear." "Then I'll be the exception," Desmond replied flatly. "I want every complaint that's ever been filed against Calder. Everything Stratton tried to bury. And I want names, pilots, stewards, passengers, anyone who saw this man lose control. You'll need clearance. Some of those records are sealed." "I'm not asking," Desmond said. "I'll call General Atherton if I have to." "We're not negotiating anymore." Franklin hesitated, then handed over a manila folder he'd been carrying under his arm. Inside were a dozen names and half a dozen redacted reports, incidents of misconduct, all dismissed with generic apologies or vague disciplinary action. A pattern, a timeline, a trail. Desmond opened the folder slowly, his eyes scanning each report. His expression didn't change, but his silence deepened. Calder's behavior had been documented before: unreported bruises on a teenage boy, a recorded shouting match with a disabled veteran, a hushed-up altercation over a crying baby. And now, Malik. He handed the folder back. "I need legal counsel." "Not just one. I want a team." Franklin nodded. "Already have 2 on standby. One of them clerked under the judge who oversaw the Grayfield brutality case. The other's a former JAG, owes you a favor." Desmond gave a slow nod of approval. "Start assembling." "We'll need investigators too. And media strategists." "You're going public?" Franklin asked, eyebrows raised. "They already did," Desmond said, nodding toward the television where Stratton's official statement rolled across the bottom of the screen. "We regret the altercation that occurred due to passenger misbehavior." They want to bury the truth behind that phrase. "And what about Calder?" "He's irrelevant now," Desmond said coldly. "This isn't about a man with a coffee pot. This is about the airline that handed it to him." For the next few hours, the hospital became his command post. Calls were made to former colleagues, military contacts, civil rights attorneys, and retired federal agents. The plan wasn't just about retaliation, it was about exposure. Every system that had protected Calder would be brought into the light. Desmond requested private security for Malik's room. He gave a statement to the press but limited his words, knowing silence could be more powerful when timed correctly. Then came the social wave. Hashtags erupted, hashtag justice for Malik, hashtag burned by Stratton, hashtag coffeepot assault. Activists picked up the story. Influencers shared the footage. News anchors speculated over whether this would be the case that redefined airline accountability. Stratton Air's stock dropped 9% before noon. But Desmond wasn't watching the markets. He sat in the hospital's dim recovery lounge, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady like he had on combat fields. But this wasn't combat. This was something else. This was personal. This was his son. Across the room, Franklin returned with an update. The judge we wanted is interested. He's willing to consult, maybe even testify if we need his interpretation of the records you've got. Desmond opened his eyes. Good. Then let's give Stratton their first lesson. Franklin tilted his head. Which is? That justice, Desmond said, standing slowly, was no longer a plea. It was a campaign. The door to Malik's hospital room clicked shut behind the nurse as Colonel Desmond Granger stood at the edge of his son's bedside, his hands balled into fists so tight the veins in his forearms looked ready to burst. The sterile white walls, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the slow hiss of oxygen, all of it felt distant, like the outer edge of a battlefield haze. Malik lay motionless beneath thin sheets, his head swathed in white gauze, the left side of his face misshapen and swollen from burns and broken bone. The boy's lips were cracked, and his skin bore the deep red stains of healing trauma. He looked far too small, far too quiet for the fire Desmond knew lived inside him. Then a whisper, barely audible. Why? Desmond leaned closer, startled. Malik's eyelids fluttered, not fully opening. The word was faint, full of pain and confusion, and yet it struck the colonel like a direct order barked in the field. His grip tightened around Malik's frail fingers. I promise you, Desmond murmured, his voice low and steady. We'll get the answer. I won't rest until we do, and I will make sure the world knows who did this. Malik drifted back into sedation. Desmond stood still for a moment, pressing a soft kiss to his son's forehead. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, his boots striking the tile with a sound that echoed determination. Back in his temporary quarters at the base, Desmond spread Stratton Air's internal manuals across a long table. Next to them lay the documents Franklin Ross had handed him, copies of complaint forms buried in company archives, emails from passengers ignored, disciplinary recommendations against Calder that had vanished without action. Redacted lines jumped out like silent admissions of guilt. Desmond marked each suspicious section with a steady hand, cross-referencing timestamps and employee logs. No accountability, no pattern of retraining, just reroutes and cover-ups, he muttered, voice low but sharp. He didn't see an airline. He saw a chain of command rotted with negligence. Stratton Air hadn't just failed his son, they'd empowered the man who nearly killed him. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit detention room at the regional airport facility, Travis Calder sat alone, sweat beading on his forehead. His flight attendant uniform was wrinkled, collar askew, dried coffee staining the sleeves like burn marks of his own. The interrogation had been brief so far, just a few pressing questions, but each one cut deeper than the last. You do understand the boy's father is Colonel Desmond Granger? One officer had said, his tone clipped. Calder had nodded, jaw twitching. Didn't know that at the time, he mumbled. The officer stared for a beat longer than necessary. You do now. Calder's stomach twisted. He had been counting on Stratton Air to send legal backup, someone to spin the incident, someone to protect him. But no one had shown yet, only silence and the growing realization that perhaps he was no longer an asset worth shielding. At Westfield Base Hospital, Desmond took a call in the hallway from Franklin, who was still piecing together a wider picture. The deeper I dig, Franklin said, the worse it gets. Stratton Air received multiple incident reports about Calder, rude behavior, hostile remarks, even a past incident involving a minor, all swept under the rug. The company claimed insufficient evidence or passenger exaggeration. Standard playbook. Desmond's eyes narrowed. I want everything. Every memo, every complaint, every signed dismissal that never went through. You'll have it, Franklin replied. But Des, they're going to fight back. They always do. Let them, Desmond said flatly. They've already started a war. I'm just answering it. Back in his room, Desmond opened a fresh file marked Safety Compliance. It outlined Stratton Air's disciplinary procedures. The words zero tolerance were underlined in company blue at the top, yet not a single line described what happened when those protocols were ignored, especially by staff. He flipped the page and found a clause stating, "Management reserves the right to suspend or dismiss without external notification in matters deemed minor." His lips curled in disdain. That clause was their shield, their loophole, their excuse. Suddenly, a junior officer knocked and stepped in. "Sir, hospital's stabilizing the boy for surgery now. Plastic trauma specialists estimate 8 hours minimum. They say it's severe." Desmond nodded, jaw tightening. "He'll pull through." "Yes, sir." Once alone, he returned to the footage. Several passengers had sent him clips, one even from a hidden phone lens, showing Calder looming over Malik, the glint of the coffee pot, the shout, the scream. He watched the frames carefully, pausing on the flash of boiling water and Malik's face disappearing beneath it. He replayed it, again and again, until it stopped being shock and became purpose. That night, just before the surgical team began their work on Malik, Desmond returned to the hospital room. His son, now unconscious under anesthesia, looked fragile, but even beneath the swelling and tubes, there was strength. Desmond leaned close. "I gave my life to this country," he whispered, "but now I give every breath to this fight. They will answer for what they did. You rest. Let your father handle the war." He stood up, adjusted his collar, and walked out, the weight of a new mission heavy on his shoulders. The world outside was waiting. Lawyers, journalists, cowards in suits, and Desmond was ready. His boots echoed once more as he left the ward, a sound no longer of a soldier at ease, but of a commander on the march. The father's war had shifted from foreign fields to courtroom floors. The courtroom doors slammed shut with a dull echo, silencing the buzz of reporters and protesters that flooded the steps outside. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge called the hearing to order, banging the gavel twice as murmurs settled into a tense quiet. Colonel Desmond Granger sat upright at the plaintiff's table, dressed in full military uniform, his shoulders squared, face impassive. He said nothing, but his presence alone commanded a hush more powerful than any spoken word. Beside him sat Major Franklin Ross and 2 seasoned attorneys, their files stacked like fortresses, their expressions sharpened with focus. Across the room, Travis Calder entered with noticeable hesitation. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wore a wrinkled navy blazer, a poor attempt at formality compared to the steel composure radiating from Desmond. Flanked by Stratton Air's legal team, Calder looked like a man clutching at the last edges of control. One of the lawyers leaned in, whispering rapidly, but Calder barely registered it. His eyes darted once to Desmond, then quickly away. "Court is now in session," the judge declared, adjusting his spectacles and peering at the docket. "Granger versus Stratton Air and Travis Calder. We will begin with the presentation of evidence. The prosecution wasted no time. They cued video clips from passengers' phones. The room darkened slightly as the projector lit up. Gasps echoed as the footage played. Calder towering over Malik, his voice raised. Then the terrifying moment the coffee pot smashed into the teen's face, followed by screams and frantic movement. The judge leaned back, jaw tight, his pen frozen mid-note. Medical photos followed, close-ups of Malik's burned cheek, fractured cheekbone, and swollen jaw, accompanied by testimony from the onboard medic. The jurors watched in stunned silence. Some glanced at Desmond, whose expression hadn't changed since the hearing began. But beneath that stony exterior, a storm brewed. Every frame of video, every injury report was a wound reopened. Then came Franklin Ross. Calm and clear-voiced, he laid out the pattern of complaints Stratton Air had received about Calder over the years, none of which had been properly investigated. "Your Honor," he said, lifting a worn folder, "this is not an isolated incident. It is a failure of accountability. It is a failure of culture." One by one, passengers who had been aboard the flight took the stand. A middle-aged man, a schoolteacher, a college student, they each told the same truth. Malik had done nothing wrong. He was respectful, one said, polite, quiet. That man, he pointed at Calder, was the problem Calder's defense shifted uncomfortably. They leaned into a new tactic. One attorney stood and spoke with practiced regret. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragic misunderstanding." Emotions ran high, but Mr. Calder has served loyally for years, and the young man in question, while I don't mean to speak ill, wasn't exactly a model passenger. The courtroom tensed. The jury stirred. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Desmond didn't move. Not until the judge invited the defense to present their final counterpoint for the day. And then it happened. The lead corporate attorney, a tall, silver-haired man with a quiet voice but sharp eyes, stepped forward holding a thick binder. "Your Honor," he began, "we regret that we must introduce this. But in fairness, the character of all parties must be weighed. We submit this internal record from military archives indicating that Colonel Desmond Granger was once the subject of an investigation related to excessive disciplinary measures in his unit." The room broke into immediate murmurs. Reporters at the back scrambled to type. The jury looked stunned. Calder shifted for the first time, a faint smile cracking the edges of his lips. His eyes flicked toward Desmond with the faintest glimmer of hope. Desmond's attorneys exchanged concerned glances. Franklin leaned in, whispering something urgent. But Desmond remained still, his jaw clenched. The judge called for silence, asking for order in the courtroom. The corporate lawyer continued, sliding the binder toward the judge. "This isn't conjecture, Your Honor. It's formal record, and while we understand the colonel's pain, it raises a question of perspective. Was his interpretation of the incident perhaps colored by his own history with force?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Franklin stood suddenly. "Objection, Your Honor. These files are contextually incomplete and dangerously misleading. Sustained, for now," the judge said, though his voice held uncertainty. "But we'll examine their admissibility. Court is adjourned for today." The gavel cracked once. The courtroom burst into whispers again as people stood. Desmond remained seated, his hands clasped, eyes staring straight ahead. Calder was already being whisked out by his team, but not before turning once to glance back, the faintest smirk on his face. Franklin touched Desmond's shoulder gently. "They're playing dirty, Colonel." "Twisting old records." "I know," Desmond said, his voice low, the gravel of restrained fury beneath. "Let them." "I've got nothing to hide outside," the reporters swarmed, microphones raised, flashes popped, but Desmond didn't speak. He walked through the crowd without answering a single question, his silence more powerful than any denial. Back inside the courthouse, the judge remained seated long after everyone had gone. He tapped the edge of the binder thoughtfully, the courtroom empty but the echoes of what had just occurred still reverberating in the silence. The father, who came for justice, now stood accused of cruelty himself. The courtroom fell into a stunned hush as the airline's attorney, Mr. Covington, placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the bench. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady but smug, "we believe this documentation is relevant to the character of Colonel Desmond Granger." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Covington." The attorney nodded and flipped the folder open. "Years ago, while commanding his unit, Colonel Granger was subject to a disciplinary review for excessive use of force during a training exercise. These are the files. We believe they call into question his credibility as a moral authority in this case." Gasps echoed through the courtroom, followed by a chorus of whispers that filled the room like a rising wind. Desmond didn't blink. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, hands folded calmly over his knees. His uniform, ironed to perfection, bore no hint of weakness. Across the aisle, Calder shifted in his seat, emboldened by the sudden attack on his accuser. Desmond could feel it, the smugness returning to the man's posture, like a snake lifting its head after being stepped on. The airline had just played its biggest card, and it wasn't just aimed at Desmond's reputation, it was aimed at everything he stood for. During the recess, Desmond and Major Franklin Ross met in the judge's chambers. The air was still, heavy with unsaid thoughts. Franklin closed the door and turned, his face grim as he dropped a copy of the file onto the small wooden table between them. "They're not lies," he said quietly, "but they're not the truth either. Twisted summaries. That review was closed without action. They're using your toughest moments out of context." Desmond stood by the window, looking out over the courthouse parking lot. The distant hum of traffic barely registered. His thoughts were not on the smear, but on his son, bandaged, broken, and brave. "They're trying to shift the trial," he muttered, "turn the focus from Calder's violence to my past." "They're scared," Franklin said, stepping closer. "Scared because we're winning. Scared because the truth is working." Desmond turned, his eyes hard but clear. "This isn't about Calder anymore. It's about a system protecting itself, a chain of power that hides its rot behind good press and paychecks." Franklin nodded slowly. "Then, let's cut through the links." That night, Desmond sat at Malik's bedside in Westfield Base Hospital. The room was dimly lit, machines blinking in slow, steady rhythm. The boy's face was still swollen, features masked beneath gauze and bruises, but his eyes, faintly open, held clarity. Desmond pulled up a chair. "They're dragging my name through the mud," he said, his voice low but steady. "Trying to make it look like I'm no better than the man who hurt you." Malik blinked, his voice barely audible. "Because you're standing up." Desmond leaned closer. "They're using old mistakes. Ones I already paid for and corrected. They're afraid of accountability, son. That's what this is. Power doesn't like being questioned. So it strikes back." Malik shifted weakly and whispered, "Then we show them what real strength is." Desmond exhaled slowly, something shifting in his chest. Pride. Not just the pride of a soldier or a father, but of a man watching his son become more than he ever expected. Malik's spirit, battered but unbroken, was now their weapon, and Desmond would wield it with precision. The next morning, Desmond returned to court, not with anger, but with strategy. He brought documents that clarified the disciplinary review, statements from his commanding officers, performance reports, and letters of commendation following the incident. Each detail painted a full picture, not of a violent man, but of a disciplined leader under impossible circumstances, falsely scrutinized by those too far from the battlefield to understand its demands. On the stand, Desmond explained it plainly. "What they call misconduct," he said, "was a moment of hard command in a simulated crisis. No soldier was harmed. No complaint was filed by the men who served under me, and the review was closed because the truth won out then, just as it will now." The jurors leaned in. Eyes that once held doubt began to soften. Even the judge's pen paused mid-note. Desmond continued. "They want to change the subject because they can't defend what happened to my son. But I ask you, look at the evidence, listen to the witnesses, and decide what this case is really about." Whispers began again, this time with a different tone. Jurors glanced at one another, seeing not a flawed father, but a man who had faced hard trials and never flinched. Later that day, Franklin clapped him on the shoulder. "You turned it back on them." The jury saw it. Desmond offered a tight nod. "They tried to break me," he said quietly, glancing toward the door that led back to the courtroom. "But in doing so, they revealed exactly how far they're willing to go to bury the truth." He looked up at the courthouse flag fluttering outside the window and whispered, "This fight's not just mine anymore." As proceedings resumed, something had changed in the room. The energy had shifted. Even Stratton Ayres' lawyers looked uneasy, sensing the smear had failed. What they thought would fracture the colonel had only forged him stronger. The attempt to break the father only strengthened the son's cause. The offer sat on the polished wooden table like a loaded weapon, silent, gleaming, dangerous. A thick envelope of documents. A number with too many zeros. A promise that Malik's surgeries, rehabilitation, and psychological trauma would all be paid for if they would just walk away. Colonel Desmond Granger didn't move at first. The corporate attorney across from him shifted uncomfortably in his tailored suit, mistaking Desmond's stillness for hesitation. But Desmond wasn't hesitating. He was restraining. His hand rested flat against the table, fingers splayed, knuckles rigid. His eyes were fixed not on the offer, but on the mental image of his son lying in that hospital bed, face wrapped in gauze, eyes swollen shut. "Is that all my son's voice is worth to you?" Desmond asked finally, his voice calm, too calm. The attorney cleared his throat. "Colonel Granger, this settlement ensures your family receives full compensation. It's more than fair, and it spares everyone a prolonged—" Desmond slid the folder back across the table with deliberate precision. The faint scrape of the manila edges against wood was louder than the lawyer's arguments. "You're not trying to spare us. You're trying to spare yourselves. He rose, straightening his uniform jacket with one sharp tug, the metals on his chest catching the courtroom's soft overhead light. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his shoes echoing down the narrow hallway as the stunned legal team watched him go. Inside the courtroom, tension hung like fog. The gallery was full, reporters, law students, activists, and families who had flown from across the country to witness the conclusion of a case that had come to represent something much bigger than one boy on one flight. Every seat was filled, every eye alert. As Desmond re-entered and took his place beside his attorney and Franklin Ross, even the murmurs stopped. The judge gave a nod. "Colonel Granger, you may address the court." Desmond stepped forward, facing the jury directly. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. Every word he spoke had lived in his chest for weeks. No, years. "My son, Malik, boarded that plane with a backpack, a hoodie, and a heart full of ambition. He wasn't violent. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't loud. He asked for tea." A hush fell heavier over the room, and for that, he was assaulted, burned, beaten, and left crying in an aisle while a man in uniform used authority as a weapon. But what hurts more is knowing how many watched and said nothing until the damage was done. He paused, the weight of silence pressing into the walls. "My son's only crime," he continued, "was asking for a simple kindness on a flight. A kindness he was denied because of prejudice disguised as policy and power disguised as professionalism." A woman in the back wiped her eyes. One juror leaned forward, elbows on knees, listening intently. Desmond's voice softened. "I've spent my life in service to this country. I've trained young men to follow rules, to honor chain of command, to show restraint, but I never trained my son for what happened that day. I never imagined I'd have to." He looked at Calder, seated at the defense table, pale and hunched, no longer the cocky authority figure who had barked orders midair. Desmond didn't glare. He didn't accuse. He simply looked at him with the sadness of a man who had seen too much. The defense team had planned for this moment. They had prepped Calder for weeks, but nothing could have prepared them for what followed. Calder stood. "I want to speak," he said, surprising even his lawyers. The judge hesitated, then allowed it. Calder walked stiffly to the witness stand, swallowing hard. He looked smaller now, deflated. His gaze didn't go to the jury or to Desmond. It went to the floor, as if searching for the man he used to be. "I snapped," he said, voice thin. "I've been angry for a long time. Years of pressure, disrespect, being overlooked, and I let all of that land on a boy who did nothing wrong. I saw his face, and instead of seeing a passenger, I saw everything I was bitter about." He looked up then, eyes glassy. It wasn't him. It was me. All me. Gasps rippled quietly through the gallery. Even the court stenographer hesitated before resuming her typing. The jury's expressions shifted, some in shock, others in somber acknowledgement. For the first time, the trial wasn't just about facts, video footage, or policies. It was about something harder to define, something more dangerous. What happens when power is left unchecked, when people in uniform forget who they're there to serve, when silence lets a spark become a fire. Desmond stayed seated, but inside, his thoughts stirred like a storm beneath still water. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. Forgiveness was not the objective. Justice was. The judge called a recess, but no one moved. The atmosphere was too thick, too heavy with what had just been laid bare. Desmond glanced toward the gallery where Franklin sat. His old friend gave him a subtle nod, a quiet recognition of a battle well fought, not finished, but undeniably turned. And beside him, on a screen wheeled in for remote viewing, Malik watched from his hospital bed, his face still bruised, but his eyes bright with something new. Strength, not just physical, but earned. The case was no longer only about who was guilty. It was about what kind of world Malik would return to once he healed, and what kind of father would make sure that world was ready. In the quiet that followed Calder's confession, no one dared speak. Not because they were afraid, but because they finally understood the weight of everything they had witnessed. In that silence, the truth rang louder than any verdict. The jury foreman stood up, a folded sheet of paper gripped tightly in his hand. The courtroom held its collective breath. A long silence lingered, broken only by the distant click of a camera shutter and the soft whir of the ceiling fan above. Colonel Desmond Granger sat with his back straight, hands calmly folded in his lap, though every muscle beneath his uniform was taut with restrained anticipation. Beside him, Malik sat with his face partially hidden beneath fresh bandages, his eyes steady despite the weight of the moment. We, the jury, find the defendant, Travis Calder, guilty of aggravated assault. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom, rising like a wave. The judge tapped his gavel once to restore order. The foreman continued. We further find Stratton Air guilty of negligence and systemic misconduct. The second verdict dropped like a hammer. A sharp breath escaped from one of Stratton Air's attorneys. Calder's legs buckled slightly as he gripped the defense table. His face, once so smug and unshaken, paled with the knowledge that his uniform would no longer shield him. The judge cleared his throat, eyes scanning the courtroom with solemn authority. The court awards damages totaling $8 million in compensatory and punitive restitution to the plaintiff, Malik Granger. Additionally, Stratton Air is hereby ordered to— He paused, emphasizing each word— redesign its employee training program, implement quarterly psychological evaluations for all flight attendants, and establish an independent review board. Said board will be chaired by Colonel Desmond Granger. A ripple of gasps passed through the rows of spectators. Desmond didn't react, not with a smile nor a nod. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the gravity of the moment. It wasn't joy he felt. It was duty fulfilled, pain acknowledged, and the beginning of something much larger than personal vindication. As the gavel struck for the final time, the courtroom burst into applause. Not the wild kind that follows victory, but the slow, rising applause of people who had witnessed justice being delivered through persistence and truth. Calder, now surrounded by court officers, glanced back at Malik as he was handcuffed. There was no hatred in Malik's expression, only stillness. That, more than any glare or outburst, seemed to rattle Calder. He tried to speak, but the officers urged him forward. His name, once sewn proudly into a navy blue uniform, now echoed through the halls as a cautionary tale. The press conference began just minutes later, outside the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as Desmond and Malik stood at the podium. A sea of microphones was positioned in front of them. The crowd spilled into the streets, reporters, students, advocates, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case every step of the way. Malik stepped forward first. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. A hush fell over the crowd. I want to thank everyone who stood up, who spoke out, and who didn't let this be forgotten, Malik began, his voice steady despite its softness. I still plan to compete in debate. I may not look the same, but I still believe in the power of words. I believe that our voices matter, that mine does. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others simply bowed their heads in respect. It wasn't the volume of Malik's speech that struck them. It was the calm clarity, the proof that a 17-year-old could survive hatred and still speak with grace. Desmond stepped beside his son. He didn't need to say much. His presence, tall and unmoved, had already spoken volumes in every courtroom appearance and press image. He placed one hand gently on Malik's shoulder, the other resting at his side. Your voice is stronger than ever now, Desmond whispered, audible only because the nearest microphone caught it. Malik glanced up, a faint smile breaking through the shadows of the bandages. Then let's use it, he replied. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields but in courtrooms, where truth becomes the loudest weapon. A minute later, the cabin froze, his father boarded in uniform, and everything changed. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and sudden accountability for unchecked abuse of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke thought about justice, and inspire action toward dignity, equality, and reform.